Hi, everybody. My name's Kimberly Maize, and I am a trauma resolution expert. I am the creator of the Trauma Response Syndrome model and a previous clinical social worker turned trauma revolutionary. I am proud to introduce my daughter and co host, Savannah Woodard.
Thanks, Mom. I'm Savannah, a second generation trauma specialist, a trauma informed coach, and care advocate, and together we are a new generation.
We are a mother daughter powerhouse duo determined to decrease the stigma of trauma and bring focus to healing transgenerational trauma through open conversations.
Please listen as we share our story on how we healed transgenerational trauma through radical self awareness and responsibility.
Because remember, when families heal,
Society heals.
thank you.
Hello, and welcome back to a New Generation podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Last week, we talked a little bit about enmeshment, or a lot of it about enmeshment and how much it affected our relationship as well as the other relationships in our lives, other romantic relationships and my children. And this week, we're going to be talking about boundaries and why boundaries are important to maintain a well-adjusted relationship. So I think the first question, we're just going to dive deep right away here. Why do you feel like it's difficult for people to set boundaries within their family system?
Well, I think this is a really multi-level and complex question and answer because there's so many reasons for that. But one of the main reasons is that maintaining family systems is one of the strongest trauma-based motivator for behaviors. So if we're looking at what causes people to do what they do, why are we doing what we're doing? How does trauma motivate behaviors? If we look at, okay, what is a person doing in their life and why? Well, they're doing certain things to maintain their family system. That's how people are trying to get their needs met. And some of these reasons are for, very basic reasons, which is why it's so difficult to heal and recover from transgenerational trauma. Poverty, sometimes literally our family are the only people that can babysit our kids while we go to work, which was, the case for me. And the parents provide, or the family provides a false, a lot of times, sense of connection and attachment. And we receive a lot of messages from our families about family. We also receive those messages from society, from our culture. Family is everything. Blood is thicker than water. We do everything for family. Families automatically put first. And that was definitely in my family system and growing up. And, we're also not given the autonomy or agency as children to become well-adjusted adults. And so we don't learn how to set boundaries. There's oftentimes no boundaries. There's like in our case, there's enmeshment. The boundaries were very few. And, when we have all of these perceptions and unmet needs met, boundaries aren't allowed. They aren't taught. And a lot of times we get change back messages from family if we try to set a boundary. You're doing something wrong to our family. And like I said before, it's, there's a lot of just basic reasons why, because of our life circumstances, we depend on family when we have to. And it makes it very difficult to be able to set boundaries. And, part of the trauma recovery process resolution is developing what I call a trauma, a non-trauma based identity, where trauma is no longer motivating our behaviors, and trauma is no longer the core reason why we do what we do. We learn, how our trauma responses are affecting our behaviors. We also learn, the coping skills that we develop in childhood to survive causes us to internalize blame and abandon ourselves. And as a result, we don't even know what our boundaries would be. We don't even know what they could possibly be, or what they need to be, or even how our families are crossing those boundaries, if we had them. And so, like I said, when we start developing our trauma-free or non-trauma based identity, there's a period of limbo, and it's a very difficult period because we are trying to step out of our trauma-based identity, but we don't have a new trauma-free identity yet. And that's when a lot of self-sabotaging happens. That's when, a lot of fear and confusion happens, because we don't know who we are at all. Because when we're traumatized, our identity is based on that trauma. When we start coming out of that, we literally usually have no identity.
Right.
And we're like, who are we? And at that time, it's difficult to determine where our family fits. And a lot of times that's when people cut people out, and there's a very, no more family. It's dysfunctional, it's toxic. And that leaves, this is the most critical thing for people to understand, is when we tell our clients or encourage our clients or teach people that they need to cut out family right away, that leaves no room for processing of ambivalence, because people are ambivalent towards their family. They love and hate them at the same time. And if we just say you need to cut them out, then the ambivalence that's felt often has no place to go. And
it often gets recreated in relationships.
And so, because if we just teach, cut them out, they're toxic, they're dysfunctional, then what do we do with but I love them at the same time? What do I do with this? What do I do with these feelings? Yes, I need to learn to grieve the loss of my family and my parents and those kinds of things. But there's also a pull, like I want them back. And that's when the self-sabotaging can happen, or, we're calling our mom or whatever, because there is no room for those feelings of ambivalence in these, like, we often, we don't have room for talking about the love and the good stuff and the stuff that creates the ambivalence in the first place, if we just have to think, well, they're just toxic. And also, there is no room for repair. And I'm not saying that all families can have repair, because they can't. I mean, I haven't talked to most of my family for 30 years. So I understand that. But, the boundaries that we need to learn can come with potential interaction. And I'm not saying that that's the case for everyone by any means, but in families where there is potential for some repair, we learn how to set boundaries with these new trauma-free or non-trauma-based identities. That's one of the whole goal. We learn how to set boundaries in all of our relationships, not just with our family of origin. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of brings up the next question that I have of, how do you feel like the lack of boundaries in your family system in childhood manifested?
In disorganized attachment, mostly. And fragmentation and dissociation. I mean, literally my family, when I was growing up, was like a free-for-all. It was like being raised by wolves. There were no adults around that were mentally stable or, when I think back, it's like my primary caregivers were my mother, although I literally have no memories of her. I can count the number of memories on my hand. She was gone. I don't know where she was. It was in the 60s, 70s. She was partying, doing, a lot of drugs with my dad. So I was left with my grandmother and my uncles, and my grandmother probably had DID, would be my guess. She was a child most of the time, and my uncles were heroin addicts. So, and, dealt guns and meth, and, and then there was all these cult members around and their children. I mean, it was like, there were no boundaries. There was nothing. There was no parenting at all. Zero. And, when you grow up in those kinds of environments, you fragment, you dissociate. But also at the same time, I was very much taught you look out for family no matter what, even when they're committing crimes, even when they're hurting children. I was taught to lie to the police probably 5 years old. I can remember when I started lying to the police about where my uncles were. I was sent to the door as they were running and hiding and those kinds of things. I grew up to be a criminal with my uncles, and because that's what we did and that's what we were taught. And you protected your family no matter what. And then when I got older and when I got, in my trauma, started doing trauma work, and everything just became completely different perspective. And I started to think back about, wow, who raised me? Nobody. That's the answer. Nobody raised me. And then as a result, there were no boundaries and everything was so disorganized. And that's kind of when I think about you and me, I felt so out of control. And because there was no emotion regulation, there was no self-soothing, it was just like total chaos internally and externally most of the time. And, when I did start setting boundaries in different ways in our family system, it led to complete cutoff for most of them. And I wasn't able to do that until I was years into my starting to integrate from being so fragmented. So, setting boundaries with family is a very complex scenario that takes a lot of resolution. And I do want to mention, when I first started doing my trauma work, I did cut my mother out before the rest of my family. I cut my mom out for years. I spoke to her not at all. I was full of rage, and I needed that time, and I took that time. And we have had, there were reasons why I brought her back into my life, mostly because of Savannah and my grandkids, because and my brother. I would have lost my brother completely if I wouldn't engage with my mom. And so the moral of the story is I have such strong boundaries with my mother now, like what she's allowed to talk to me about, not allowed to talk to me about. Don't mention food. Don't mention my weight. Don't mention my appearance, not what you're eating or not eating. I've tell her, you're not allowed to gaslight me. You're gaslighting me right now. The boundaries are super strong because I don't have an attachment to losing her. I've already lost her. I never really had her. And, so those are the kinds of things that you start realizing with your trauma recovery, of what boundaries you need and want. And that's difficult to understand early on. That's, and so it's important for people who assist in recovery to recognize why, people can't set boundaries and why they might still need their family, and realizing people will do anything to maintain their family system. And that 100% means hurting themselves, abandoning themselves, acting out, attention seeking, all those, because we say those words here because there's no shame. Of course, we're attention seeking. Of course, I was attention seeking.
You need
I
attention.
had no attention. I was in a psychiatric hospital to get some attention, and other very complex reasons. But why is there shame around that? Of course, that's what I was doing. So, boundaries is a very multi-layered and complex scenario, and we really can't figure out what boundaries until we learn to connect and attach to ourselves and learn our internal boundaries and what boundaries we need and aren't necessarily necessary. And we have to recognize, what behaviors do I have? What's motivating me? How am I abandoning myself to maintain my family system? That's number one.
Yeah. And I think that brings up a really good point, is that there's two different types of boundaries. There's internal boundaries and there's external boundaries. And oftentimes internal boundaries are the first step. A lot of times, I think in our experience and the people that we work with, a lot of times we say to them, you might not quite be ready to set external boundaries, which means those around you understand that there's boundaries, first of all, and also the impact of what that may have on your relationship, versus an internal boundaries, like what you're saying, of maybe the internal boundary with grandma would have been, I'm not going to talk about food with my mom. And I know that that's very triggering for me. So that's my first boundary. Maybe I'm not ready to tell her yet that she can't talk about food, but the first step is that I'm not going to talk about food. And so just to differentiate,
that's actually true.
Yeah, in between internal boundaries versus external boundaries. I see that a lot, especially when people have decided that they don't want to cut their parents out and they want to be able to do their work while maintaining relationship. A lot of my clients have said, I was setting so many boundaries at Christmas and my family didn't even know it. And I kept myself safe and it didn't disrupt my family system. Maybe 2 years from now, we can talk about it with my family. So I think that's just something that's important to be said.
That's a really good point. And, our one of our main goals in this podcast and offering the work that we do is offering families an opportunity to come and work with us, because there are potential for repair a lot of the time. And sometimes people just need to work through it and come to a space where it's safe and people around them know what they're doing and helping and validating all those things, and can learn what is needed within the family system. Everybody's getting validated. The parents are, the kids are, everybody, because everyone in the family system has valid reasons of why they act the way they do and trauma. And if they're there, that means they're willing to look at themselves and do their own work, or they wouldn't come and work with us. And again, we're not talking about families that are overtly, like I said, I have cut out most of my family completely, will not talk to them. So I'm not saying, all families are, no, I'm not saying that, but there are so many families that are able to validate and repair, and
they just don't know how.
They just don't know.
They just need the opportunity.
So I just wanted to add that. But what you said about internal versus external boundaries is really important, because it's true. I did set a lot of internal boundaries with myself before I was, because essentially partly about setting boundaries too, especially with certain parents or family members, is getting to a point where you realize you might lose them.
Yeah. And are you ready for that?
Are you ready for that?
Yeah. Or do you just need a little space? Internally.
Yeah. And my mother was one of my main perpetrators in re-traumatizing myself in my adult life, as far as family of origin. So, because she was still in my life as was my stepdad. So that's a really good point. Do you feel like you made internal boundaries long before you set them to me?
Yeah, I feel like I started setting boundaries internally of who I wanted to be, and maybe didn't relate them to you yet, but I started recognizing, okay, this doesn't feel good when I act this way, or this doesn't feel good when I say this, or this is the response that I get, so I probably shouldn't say that. And so I started being more aware of like my own internal experience and not doing certain things. And obviously sobriety. I mean, that was a huge internal boundary for me. Many different levels of sobriety over the year. I've gotten more and more sober over the years.
More and more sober.
Yeah, cutting out more and more, recognizing that, I didn't realize for a long time that I was an alcoholic. It took me a long time to realize that. And so that form of sobriety came way after I got sober off of stimulants. So just a little background there.
Yeah, and I would like to add real quick, we use language that we're comfortable with because there's no shame or stigma behind it for us personally, like alcoholic addiction, those kinds of things, because we're a harm reduction perspective. We don't look at those issues the same way as a lot of other people. And so when Savannah would say I'm an alcoholic, that's because that's what feels safe for her, and there's no shame or stigma for her behind it. If that isn't safe for you guys, just change the language. None of this is about you're a bad person because you're an alcoholic. It's like trauma motivated her behaviors to drink in excess to where it impacted her life to the point it no longer was working.
Yeah. And I recognize that because of my trauma responses, I can't do a little of something. Some people can, have a problem with drinking as a distraction, and they don't consider themselves an alcoholic because maybe over time they could develop a healthier relationship with alcohol as they've become more well-resolved, which I feel like maybe in the big picture, I could do that because I've become resolved enough. But at this point, it's just not worth it for me. I'm so much better, clearer mind, clearer body. I feel better physically, less pain when I don't drink. And so even now, I don't know if all the time I would call myself an alcoholic. It definitely depends on the audience. And who, because if I go to certain people and say I'm an alcoholic, they're going to judge me. Versus right here, I know we're not going to be judged, so I can use that language. So I think it's important that you say that, and maybe that changes over time.
Well, that's a really good point that you say that, because that is my perspective, is that oftentimes, or sometimes, oftentimes, once we resolve the reasons why we need to drink or use, we really don't need it anymore or want it. Now, that's not the case for everybody. Some people have to like put it down forever, and that's totally fine and acknowledged. But like in my case, I took my first drink at 8 years old. 8 years old, I started drinking. The first time I smoked pot was 5. Wow. 5 years old. I just realized that. Yeah, because there was a circle of, this is crazy, but there was a circle of adults that were in my grandma's front yard that were watching and listening to the
trigger warning.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
Watching the guy that was the cult leader. So there was a cult in the desert that my family members belonged to. When it got busted, everybody came and lived in my grandma's house. That's why it was a complete and total circus of just trauma. And they would give drugs to their kids, LSD. We were all sitting in a circle, and I was passed a joint, and everybody was telling me how to do it. And so, all my family members were heroin addicts, and definitely addicts. I'm not going to use any other word. And so, I started drinking daily, probably 11, 12 years old, those kinds of things, using all the drugs, those meth, all of it, used all of it. And now I have absolutely zero desire to do it, any of it. I could drink a margarita once a year. There's nothing there anymore. And so I resolved all the reasons why I needed to do that, and I no longer do it or need it anymore. Now, I'm not like everyone, but some people are like that.
Yeah, and I would say for the most part, I'm like that too, especially with alcohol. I've gotten to the point that now I realize I can get those needs met in other ways.
Right.
And so I'm not saying like I go hang out with people who drink all the time. I mean, my friends, drink sparingly, or my in-laws will have wine with dinner or whatever. And I don't feel the need to drink because I get those needs met in other ways. And at the same time, if I did choose to drink, I don't know if I could only have one drink. It's just not worth it for me. So I think it's really important that when we're talking about addiction, we're talking about alcoholism, we're talking about harm reduction, the most important thing to be mindful of is that it's different for everybody. Treatment looks different for everybody. Sobriety looks different for everybody. And we need to stop judging people. And I know this is kind of an absolute, but we really got to just stop judging people and talk to people about, why do you use substances? What needs are you getting? How can we get those needs met in other ways?
And while we're on this subject, we're kind of going off a little bit on the subject, but this is really important. Harm reduction and trauma resolution approaches are 1000% needed. If people don't understand that an expectation of complete sobriety when people are coming in for a session, for some, that's detrimental. It's not going to work. They're going to lie, all of those things. I've worked with many people that are still actively drinking. It's 100% of the time, if you show up in my office or in this healing space, thank you. Good for you. Let's work on this until you don't need this anymore. Of course, I ask people to not come to session on substances just because they can't really, but if they do,
at least they're showing up. First step.
And that's 100% of the time how I will feel.
And our next episode is on addiction and substance abuse and everything. Right. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper, but coming back to the topic at hand, and the lack of boundaries, I think it's important. You shared quite a bit as a child becoming an adult. And I think it's important that now I talk a little bit of how the lack of boundaries affected me as a child and as an adult, kind of a second generation, well, multi-generations of trauma, but here, the second generation, that it's a similar thing. It's interesting to hear you reflect on your childhood, and that I had a similar experience, just to a less degree. I felt like I was left alone a lot of the time. My mom was in the house, but she was asleep. And I didn't find out until we started this podcast that she was self-medicating to sleep and things like that. And I wasn't aware of that. I just felt like my mom was asleep all the time and I must have been doing something wrong. And I internalized that a lot. And I didn't realize it until recently that those lack of boundaries really produced a lot of control mechanisms in both childhood and as an adult. And I feel like I'm not as dissociative, so it's a little easier for me to remember some of my childhood. I mean, I don't remember most of my childhood. I have maybe 20 memories from childhood, mostly bad, a few good. But I do feel like I'm able to reflect a little bit more on the feeling that I felt when I was alone and my mom was asleep. And, you know, when you're talking about me being an anxious kid, I don't remember if that was this episode or the last one, but I was so incredibly anxious as a kid. And it wasn't until last year that I realized my anxiety fueled me and my identity for years. It was the only way I knew how to find a false sense of control in a very uncontrollable situation. You know, just my mom being absent, my mom being emotionally intense and unstable a lot of the time, going in and out of hospitals, and all of that obviously made me feel very out of control. And I was really anxious as a kid, and I had a lot of somatic experiences through illness. I was really constipated. I had to go to the hospital multiple times for constipation. I was coming home all the time for being sick. And now looking back, I know that that was a somatic physical expression of my trauma, but it was also my caretaker role so deeply ingrained in my identity that I didn't feel safe enough to be away from my mom for long periods of time.
Yeah.
And in the last year or so, we've talked about, I didn't know, I wouldn't want to go to sleepovers. I wouldn't want to go to birthday parties. I wouldn't want to do things because I was so afraid of leaving my mom. And even when I was a kid, some of my most memorable things was when I would go to California for the summer, which was honestly my safe haven. I mean, that's where I could go to be a kid. As soon as I would get there, I would break out in hives from head to toe, and I would cry for days on end that I miss my mom and I miss my mom. And now looking back, it was because I was afraid you were going to die while I was gone, because I felt deeply responsible for keeping you alive.
Well, and you were shown that.
And I was shown that that was the role that I was put in, that caretaker role. And I know we've talked about this quite a bit over all of the episodes we've done so far, but when we're talking about how did the lack of boundaries show up in my life as an adult, similar to what we've said so far, my caretaker role was a big part of it, where this was the only way I knew how to behave. And without that caretaker role, I had no identity. I only had this trauma-based identity. And so everything I did was based in keeping you alive and keeping Curtis alive. And so everything I did was in order to control the environment and control what was going on. And I feel like that's where a lot of my relationships, friendships over the last 10, 20 years have been based out of control. I've lost a lot of friends by being told I was too controlling. I've had struggles in both of my relationships. Now I feel like I'm in a well-adjusted relationship. And one of the things we communicate about is how I can control things. And, I'm still trying to keep my perfectly healthy current husband from dying when he's currently healthy. And he'll say to me, Sav, you don't have to worry about stuff like that. I'm totally fine. Or I'm not sick. That's not something we have to talk about. Just like, oh, wow. Oh my God. I didn't even realize what was going on. And still to this day, my anxiety can be consuming because it's the only thing I know to identify with. And the more that I get stable, the more that gets farther away from me. And it's scary. It's my lifeline for so long. So it's interesting to think about.
Well, and that's another really important point, because we're looking at how trauma motivates behaviors. And, the top 5 or 6 motivations for behaviors, like I said earlier, one of the main is maintaining family systems. The other is control. There is not anyone, I think I can safely say that people impacted by trauma have control issues. Yeah, we do. Of course we do. What else would we be doing? We grew up in chaos. Internal control, external control. And one of our ways of trying to figure out what's going on with us or people that we work with is, how is control showing up in your life? And sometimes it's my control-based, trauma-based behaviors. I have to say, I can say this about myself without shame, are bizarre. They're bizarre. There's some of my control-based behaviors are bizarre, as were my grandmother's. I was modeled some very strange control-based behaviors. One of them is not showering.
Yeah, and I think that you're bringing up a really good point too, as we were talking about internal and external boundaries. That's true for a lot of things like control mechanisms, because there's a lot of external. So a lot of what I've talked about so far are external control, but actually internal control was, anxiety. I feel like anxiety is an internal
physical manifestation.
Of control.
Yeah.
But also
one of the reasons for anxiety.
And also a couple of those internal control mechanisms definitely would be food. And I think that's true for both of us. Or binge eating
is number one. Yeah.
Either over, I went for a long time. I don't do this anymore. I've resolved a lot of these issues. No shame if you're still doing this. I'm just being transparent. That I would go days without eating enough, to the point that I would be so hungry that I couldn't function. So then I would binge eat. And then that would make me feel like shit for enough days that I could not eat and restrict my food. And then I would binge eat. And that was my cycle up and down for many, many years. And I don't really do that anymore. I find a healthier, or excuse me, a more self-serving way to find my control, get my control needs met, like exercising, like getting ready every day, like
In balance, exercising in balance.
yeah, and having multiple calendars. I write everything down, and
She's really good at it.
yeah, that's how I
I
found
know.
I'm really organized now, and that's
that's-
how I find a healthy sense of control. And so now I just eat when I'm hungry, and I know it's kind of hard to see how those things are related, but the more and more we talk about this, it'll make more sense, obviously. And also just it's so different for every person, and it manifests so differently for everybody, that we have to talk about it to really destigmatize it and just bring awareness. So
and we'll talk more about this in later episodes, control and trauma motivated control behaviors, because they are really intricate. There's really, really intricate ways that control shows up. And it's sometimes it's just like, how could that be about control? And it's like, when you really understand trauma motivated behaviors and control, it's like, that is about control.
well, and I think that's why it's so important that people not only become trauma informed, but they become aware of the trauma response syndrome model and the work that we do, because I feel like there's so many people out there that are doing trauma motivated behavior that people just don't understand
Right.
how that could do with control. And over years and years of doing trauma resolution work with people, it's become so systematic that it's really obvious. I mean, I don't want to speak for you,
Oh,
but
absolutely.
it's really obvious what behaviors people are doing to get that control need met. And I feel like that would expedite so many people's resolution if helping professionals or those who assist in recovery really understand how control motivates our behavior, or how fear motivates our behavior, or whatever the coping skill or the trigger may be. But yeah, I'm kind of rambling, but it's just really important that we understand how trauma motivates behavior, especially from a control component.
Yeah.
So, with all of that being said, do you feel like there were any definitive times in your life where you tried to set both an internal or an external boundary within our family system in an attempt to end transgenerational trauma?
Yeah, there really were very difficult examples. I think the first example of an internal boundary would be when I just, decided to stop doing substances, drugs, and alcohol when I got pregnant with you. Um, that internal boundary, I mean, that affected my entire life, because I, lost most of my friend group, and I started moving away from my family system without any real understanding of what I was doing at the time. um you know because for since I could drive, and before that, I was kind of the partner in crime, and you know drove around while my uncles cooked meth in the back of the car and those kinds of things. And so when I made that decision to stop doing drugs and alcohol, and change the trajectory of my entire life, because at that time I went started to go to college, took a test and got into college, and just kind of tried to pull away from my family system. I didn't engage anymore with them on that level. Uh, and there was no conscious awareness at that time of what I was doing. There wasn't any kind of, at that time, I didn't even realize that my family was traumatic, because the severity of my dissociation and my fragmentation. And like you said earlier, it's, when we're raised in families, it's all we knew, all we know. And I had no realization of the extent of my trauma, or that I had any trauma, until I was 33. And so, though, that internal boundary was subconscious, because I just wanted to have a better life for you. That was mostly what it was, a better life for you. And I didn't really matter. I don't think that I really felt like I mattered or cared much about myself. Um, and so, continued to engage with the family and the family behaviors and things like that. But when you came around, that changed. It saved my life. It changed my life. And that was the first, probably internal boundary that I set. The second most significant boundary was when I sent you to treatment. That was totally and completely against my family system culture. Um, Basically, the family system was that you don't tell family secrets, is one for sure. You completely deny that anyone's using alcohol or substances, even when you're visiting people in prison. You don't, there's no outward conversation about this person has a drug addiction. Maybe they should go to treatment or something like that. No, you do the opposite. You protect the person from authorities. You protect the person from being held responsible at all. You don't. You protect the family. You keep the secrets, and you don't acknowledge that there's a problem with drugs and alcohol. And my mother said, that's not what we do in our family. Literally, when I said, it's time, she's going to treatment. I'm sending her to treatment. Your daughter's coming home drunk at 13, 14 years old. And part of that, and I think that this is true for a lot of people in the next generation. It's like, I want better than what I had.
Right.
And there were certain things that stuck out in my mind that, if somebody would have cared for me about me at 13, I wouldn't have ended up homeless and those horrible things wouldn't happen to me. My mother says, well, they didn't have stuff like that when you were young, which is completely a lie. They had all kinds of things.
Yeah.
I was literally thrown away. My mother, once I started rebelling against my mother, I was literally disposed of, and nobody cared what happened to me, and I ended up on the streets and homeless in LA, and really horrible things happened. And so what I knew was that to show her I cared, I'm going to do something about this. And again, at that time, it was like 2 or 3 years into my trauma resolution journey. I mean, it took years before I was not dissociating and stuff like that. So that was like my first conscious awareness boundary.
Yeah, because I had been using quite a while before that.
Mhm.
That was the first time that you were able to come to and set a boundary.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And I was like, it's time for me to be a parent. It's time for me to change the family dynamic and the family system. And that's what I'm going to do. And I was not supported.
And changed everything.
Yeah. So probably one of the most painful, most significant was I was raised with my two cousins, and probably one of the only people in my life that I felt any connection to was my cousin. We were raised very close, almost like like sisters. And we were born and raised in Southern California. um, she got really heavy into methamphetamine, as did her husband. And that, gambling and alcohol, I mean, there was. So I think the intention of moving from Southern California to the Midwest, where I had relocated us to get out of that ghetto, I think that's another boundary I set.
Yeah.
I moved you know across the United States away from that family to get her out of that family system. Yeah, that's another one I set.
Could you imagine if I grew up in California?
Mm-mm.
I'd be in prison.
We wouldn't be here.
Yeah, I'd be in
I'd
prison.
probably be dead. I don't know what. Yeah. So, they came, her and her husband and her two little kids came from California to the same uh, town that we lived in, and
Continue to use.
I can't describe what it was like. I mean, I was literally in literal shock. I can't describe what it was like. Um, they were they were using meth and telling me about like blowing it in the face of their son, even on like the dad is in the bathroom, the boy opens and he's blowing out meth, and um they would go to the casino and leave their kids, I mean, like 2 and 3 year old kids, alone in the car all day, all night, while they were gambling. They were driving literally drunk with the babies in the car. I mean, she was telling me that there was times she didn't want these kids, and I was literally in shock. And there was dog poop everywhere in their house, food on the floor. I mean, it was like, and the first reaction that because it took me a while to like come to the real, because I was homeless at the time. um I was obviously really going through it. You were living with my parents, and sometimes I'd live in their motor home that they owned. I don't know how they got the money for that, but and I finally started to realize what was happening, and it was so horrifying. And I decided to call Child Protection Services on them. And boy, my mother was outraged. Um, she was definitely against it, very much against it. I was enraged that my Aunt Marty went to their house, what, daily or weekly at least, for 20 years while they lived in Southern California, and saw what was happening and did nothing. Because my family, that's what my family does. Let's just pretend like nobody's doing any substances, even if it is harming children. That's definitely the truth of my childhood
And mine.
and yours.
Yeah.
So I did. I called Child Protection Services. They the Child Protection Service person came to their front door. My cousin Heather wouldn't let them in. She called her husband and they took off. They took off for 3 days with their drugs, driving around in the States until the meth was out of their children's system. So when they came back, there was no meth in their system or their children's system, but there was meth in the hair of the children. So the children were removed temporarily. They were supposed to go to treatment, all these things. None of that stuff happened. Instead, what happened is they threatened to kill me if they ever saw me again. Once they figured out it was me, because at first they didn't know. And then they figured out it was me. So they gathered up their children and moved back to their hometown in Southern California, where they just came from, and said that they'd kill me if they ever saw me again. So that is why I don't talk to half my family system.
And why it's difficult for people to set boundaries within their family system.
Yeah.
That's a key example of what people will do to maintain their trauma responses to survive.
Yep.
They'll drive around for 3 days so that they can continue to use.
Yeah. And they blamed it all on me. It was all my fault. Everything was my fault. I was the problem. I was the one
To this day.
To this day. Yeah.
Still.
Yeah. I'm afraid. I don't know what would happen if I went. I would never go back there, no matter what. But my perspective was, now we put children first. My grandmother told me once, if anyone was paying attention, somebody would have called Child Protection Services. I was like, you were my primary caregiver. And uh that I ended up after that, the grief and loss, I couldn't handle it. That's when I went inpatient 30 days at a trauma unit in Kansas City, because I couldn't handle the loss of her and those kids. Again, that sense of family, that was the only sense of family I had, was her and those kids. And even though nothing came out of it as far as help for the children, or, because they went back to doing the same thing they were doing in California, again. Matter of fact, my cousin told my Aunt Marty that because of what I did, if she ever wanted to see the kids again, that she was going to have to pay all their bills to live in California because of what I did. And she did for decades. And that's the way they are. That's the family I'm from. And so that was the boundary that shifted and changed my entire family system. I lost them all. And I went one way and they went the other. I made it through, lived through it, and I don't regret it. I don't regret it. I'd do it again. I'd do it better this time. So do you feel like you were able to set any boundaries, like when you were a child or growing up within our family system?
No. I feel like as I got a little bit older, well, so first of all, when you're a kid, you don't really realize that anything is wrong. I mean, it's
Mhm.
so normal. It's so normalized in just what you deal with that I don't think it ever even crossed my mind to set a boundary at a
Right.
young age.
Right.
Like that's just what we did. I feel like it wasn't until I got a little bit older that I started realizing that maybe what I was going through wasn't the same as what other people went through.
Mhm.
Um and obviously, once you became more trauma informed and you got your trauma informed diagnosis, then everything changed. And that's when I started realizing that was a huge wake up call. So then I feel like after that, I was able to set more boundaries with you because you were a lot more open to boundaries.
Mhm.
And we both were just kind of trying to navigate those waters and figure out what kind of relationship dynamic that we wanted. But because my grandma was still so entrenched in her old role, it was impossible for me to actually hold you accountable. Because a lot of what I was trying to do at the time was say, okay, I am upset. My mom wants me to say why I'm upset. So I've taken the time to discover why I'm upset. And then I would talk to my grandma just as someone that I thought cared about me and that I loved and felt safe. And so I would go to her to try to just talk things out, which I thought was the right thing to do. And she was so focused on triangulating and keeping you in the role that it would make me go back to old thinking and I never got anywhere. And so I feel like even when it was finally like allowed to set boundaries between you and I, it wasn't allowed within the rest of the family. Um and then it's funny because then when I did try to set boundaries, with the divide and everything, my grandma was very resistant to that. I think a big part of it was because I do think because she saw how hurt you were, she really
I
did
do.
advocate for you through all of that.
She tried her best, yeah. I
And
mean, that's 20 years after
yeah,
this whole, what I mean? That's,
yeah.
you know,
But even the conversations that she and I had, me and my grandma, through the divide and everything, it was never from a place from resolution. I feel like it was pretty much from a place of triangulation. Maybe towards the end she was trying to mediate. But again, when people are so used to their roles, they don't really know what else to do unless they do an applied effort, make applied effort. And that's not what our family does. We've
mm-mm.
made that pretty clear. um, so yeah, I feel like even for quite some time, even when you and I were trying to set more boundaries with one another, It was hard. You were
Mhm.
reactionary and overwhelmed, or I was reactionary and overwhelmed. It wasn't really until after the divide, I feel
Mhm.
like I could set healthy boundaries and get a well-adjusted response.
Oh,
And
yeah.
that's only in the last year. So,
Mhm. Mhm.
yeah.
Um, do you think that my mom was actually ever a safe person though?
She was a perceived safe person.
Perceived, yeah.
Um, and I feel like in some ways, like my basic needs, because I that was probably what was different between my relationship with her and your relationship when you were
Mhm.
a kid, was that she was married with kids and had a successful job. And so she presented a certain
Mhm.
way where I definitely knew I could go there if I got upset. Her house. I think her house was a safe place
Mm.
more than her necessarily. And grandpa felt like a safe place, even though he was an alcoholic, he worshiped me.
Yeah.
So I knew that he would always side with me. He would always want to try to protect me, even if he was too drunk to apply it. His intentions were always there. And they fed me. I knew there'd always be food there. I knew
Which
that
is
there
so
was
bizarre
always
to
a
me.
phone working there. Like
Yeah.
things like that were
Mhm.
consistent that maybe weren't consistent at our
Mhm.
house all the
Mhm.
time. But emotionally, she was definitely a perceived safe place and wasn't
Mhm.
actually safe, because the only way that she was a safe place was if I was playing out that role.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Of
Caretaker
yes.
and victim to your
Yes,
perpetrator,
I was her perpetrator and you were rescuing her.
or vice versa.
I mean, always.
You were always perpetrator, but she and I would go back and forth
Yeah.
between who was the rescuer and who was the victim.
And she tried to maintain that role for years and years after.
Well, and she subconsciously probably still would, just because she doesn't know any better, but we don't
Oh, yeah,
allow it, so
right.
she follows suit.
Mhm. Oh, and she acts out. Oh god.
Yeah.
No, it's a little better now, but man, when and she told me during the divide that sh- because her needs are primary against children, grandchildren, it doesn't matter. My mother is 1000% the primary concern to my mother. And so her focus is only on what is about her. And so she doesn't really understand what she's saying or doing. And so, when Savannah and I would have, um, you know, with Savannah and I's enmeshment I mean, we were also extremely alike and extremely close and very um focused on us all the time. We were always talking, usually about trauma, which made my mother very uncomfortable. And for a very long time. And so my mother said, when her Savannah and I are together, she is left out. And she then acts like a literal insolent child. I mean, she throws tantrums towards me. She acts out towards me. And because she thought that the relationship was between her and Savannah, and that I was out, because that's how it was throughout my whole life. Because I was the mentally ill one, she was the rescuer, Savannah was the victim of me, or like Savannah said, they changed, and so because the reality of the situation is that she never truly took care of you at all.
Which is really weird.
Never babysat you.
That's so weird for me to reflect on as an adult, because my
Never.
grandma's perception of what happened versus what actually happened is so different. And I was so used to aligning with my grandma that I assumed what she was saying was true. But now that I'm like an adult, I've worked through a lot of my work, I'm sober, and I really think back, I'm like, I don't remember her being around at all. Like, I mean, a little bit here and there, or when we all did family gatherings, we would all be together. But when I was at their house, I was with Tim.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's really interesting that she can perceive one thing to survive, and I perceive something that I feel like is fact, but perception. It's just a really interesting thing.
Well, and when denial is the main coping skill, I've never seen a family deny to the degree that my family does.
Yeah.
Like literally, somebody is literally, using to the point of dying, and there's just that's not happening. That never happened. And so her perception, it took me 10 years to finally drill it into my mother that I did not have a perfect childhood. She was not present. I mean, none of those things, because she would say, your childhood was fine. You just woke up crazy one day. And, I remember also saying to her, crying one time, I was in the car, why won't you ever take Savannah overnight? Why won't you ever babysit her? Why won't you ever care for her when you were little? When you were older and could basically fend for yourself in your teenage years, then yeah, okay. But, you didn't go over there for sleepovers or
No.
ever. Never, never.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
She would not take care of you. She would not babysit you. Her answer was, I don't know. I really don't know. And another interesting thing that's so strange to me is that my Savannah and my brother had completely different experiences of my parents than I did, because like you said, she was married by then and had a 2-income household, and she had a very good job. So and once she got married, her eating disorder, oh man, went from severe, trigger warning here, severe, I mean severe anorexia from my childhood to
Binge eating.
compulsively binge eating. So I was like, when they talk about food being around, I'm just like, it's so strange to me, because my experience of my family is there's never any food ever for anyone. And we lived in such extreme poverty when I was young that government cheese, stuff like that. There was you didn't get what you needed. And that was so much different and so, that has caused a lot of conflict with my brother and I. And it's such a different experience that you had of my mother than I did.
Yeah, it's just really interesting to think how time and boundaries can really create different realities over generations.
Yes.
And so I think that's my next and final question for you is, do you have any advice for people who are wanting to set boundaries within their family system without destroying the family?
Sure. I think that with any relationship, but especially family systems, is we need to establish first within ourselves the strength, what I call developing a relationship to self based on love and compassion. We have to recognize how our, what I call internalized blame of self, this is trauma response syndrome model language and concepts, but we have to recognize first how our trauma responses, our coping skills are maintaining our family system. What are we doing that, not to indicate fault by any means, but just how are our trauma responses maintaining this family system? Because we have to recognize what it is that this parent does or this family does that re-traumatizes me. That's the first place to start. How am I currently being re-traumatized by my family, not only in childhood? And recognizing, okay, are these people actually able to sit and listen to me and validate me? If not, to some degree, that takes sometimes, a lot of times, initially a family member will react with extreme defense. That never happened. That is a lie. That's not true. And, you have to protect yourself first. That always has to be first. And oftentimes they'll come back around and they'll think about it. They'll think through and they'll validate. You have to have somebody who validates your experiences. And are they consistent? If they say they're going to do something, do they actually do it? Do they respect what you're asking of them and actually do it? And not gaslight you, not change back message you, not, and are they willing to say, yeah, I want to work on our relationship. It's important to me. Yes, I want to improve our communication. Yes, I want to see my grandkids. What is it that I need to do to make this better?
Yeah. And I think that's really important. One of the things that you had said was that we talk about things without a place from judgment. And you may notice, or maybe you haven't noticed, that a big part of this for us is radical responsibility and self-awareness. And I feel like that's what you're talking about right now, where when we're able to take away the judgment of you're right, I'm wrong, or vice versa, or your fault, my fault, and we just take it away and say, this is what actually happened.
Mhm.
This is how you feel about it. This is how I feel about it. How can we meet in the middle while still respecting ourselves and each other's opinions? And I feel like that's where that radical responsibility goes of like, okay, your example of I want to see my grandkids. What can I do to make you more comfortable, Savannah, so that I can see your kids? And because I was able to say, well, this is what makes me uncomfortable without judgment, she was able to say, oh, dang, I do that. How can I work on that? This is how you can help me. This is what you can do to help me. And this is what I can do to help me. And let's work together and really take the shame out of it and just work together as a team to really resolve it and resolve those feelings rather than judge them and run away from them.
And we're talking now in such a calm, accepting, non-judgment. This is not come. I mean, this is years.
Yeah, it takes
work.
time.
It takes years of work. But I do want to add one thing, parents, hear me loud and clear. Your children, their needs, their opinions, their hurt feelings, they need to be heard and validated for as long as your hurt feelings need to be dealt with a therapist or somebody else. Because as parents who traumatize our children, it's our responsibility to repair. And they need to be children, and we need to relate to them as our children that we hurt for as long as it takes. Now, that doesn't mean now they get to just,
Be abusive.
And hurtful for forever. But if they're saying, Mom, this is what happened. You got to be able to just kind of hold space for that and realize what's your somatic response, what's your defense, what are you feeling inside your body when your kids are saying this to you, because that's the pain that belongs to your mom.
Yeah,
most of the time.
Yeah. And I think it's really important too that we pause here and just say, I think a big reason why it took us so long to be able to do this work is because we had no one helping us.
None.
And that's a big reason. Our therapist didn't know what to do. We've had some re-traumatization from therapy, not knowing, people didn't know how to use this language, how to think this way. And that's a big reason why we are so motivated and why we help families. There's a lot of families that we work with where my mom works with the parents and I work with the kids. And in the long run, we intend on getting everyone together. And I think it's really cool that we have been able to do this so that we can help all of you. I hope that it won't take years for people to do this work.
Yeah.
Because they have trauma specialists like you and I, and those that we train that can really guide them to mend and repair their relationship versus us. We had to do it on our own.
Man.
We were the therapist. We were the specialists. We were the victims. We were the perpetrator. And we really had to deal with all of that by ourselves. Thank God we're capable of doing that, but most people aren't.
That's so true.
So hopefully it only takes a year or, a year or two of really doing this work rather than decades, because we're here to support you.
That's true.
And it is a little bit of a plug, but it's also like, that's why we do the work that we do, because we don't want it to take you guys 10 years to be able to get to where we are.
That's right.
That's
a good point.
And the families that we've been working with are growing and evolving so quick. I mean, it makes me want to cry. It's so phenomenal to see. So if you're a helping professional or someone who assists in recovery that wants to be able to help people do this work, or if you're a mom and daughter or dad and son or whatever,
whole family,
if you want help in this, please reach out to us.
Mhm.
We really love to do this work. We're really good at it and we've healed from it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's really a phenomenal thing.
Yeah.
So just a little bit in conclusion of today, we kind of went all over the place, but we're just going a little bit deeper into some of the topics we've touched on and preparing for the topics in the future. And so today we talked a little bit more about enmeshment. We talked a little bit more about boundaries and how boundaries influence our relationship with each other and our family dynamic. And I'm actually really excited for the episodes to come. It's starting to get really juicy. Next episode, we start the first episode on a 3-part series on boundaries, which will eventually turn into our conversation on the divide, where we did something really extreme to heal transgenerational trauma. We're going to share untold perspectives of one another. So I don't 100% know what happened during the divide with my mom, and she doesn't know what happened with me. So we're going to share all of that for the first time with you raw over the next couple episodes. So please stay tuned, and we hope to see you, or we hope that you can join us every week. We really appreciate you all. Thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you so much for tuning in.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.